One of my Patreon supporters, Brett, recently said to me, Steve, I love your videos on low and slow briskets, but I don't have 12 to 14 hours to spend on a Saturday or Sunday cooking a brisket. Do you have a method that is maybe 5 or 6 hours of tending the smoker and the rest of the day I can tend to my family obligations? And I thought about it and I realized that I don't have any videos on hot and fast briskets. But there's a reason for that. When you're cooking hot and fast, you just don't have a lot of time to render all of the collagen and connective tissue in a brisket, and you really need to go to above 200 degrees Fahrenheit internal in the finishing temperature of the brisket. So I usually go up to 203, 205, 207, and because of that, they just turn out kind of grainy and dry and crumbly. And you can usually offset it if you have a really good brisket, like a Wagyu or a prime. But definitely if you're doing a select grade or choice brisket, they just don't turn out very well because you have to go to those high temperatures. To be honest, I don't even like finishing briskets above 190 degrees internal because I feel like they just get too dry and pot roasty and grainy. So I wanted to develop a hot and fast brisket method where you only had to dedicate 6 hours of active smoking time to it, but you didn't have to go above 190 degrees internal to finish it and get it super juicy and awesome and get that awesome prime ribby flavor in your brisket that I personally really love. So that's what this video is about, and I'll tell you guys, this was a tough video because I was cooking this brisket for a friend. I couldn't afford to screw it up, and I did actually make a few mistakes, but in the end, I figured out an awesome method that I think is going to save you guys a lot of time. It's going to help you to save time cooking a brisket, cook it super fast, but still get the awesome results that you get from my other low and slow methods where you cook it up to 190 for 12 to 14 hours and then hold it at 150 overnight. You're going to get those awesome results in a hot and fast brisket, and I'm really excited to tell you guys how I did it. Let's get smoking. I'm starting by trimming a Wangus Packer brisket with a traditional Texas-style trim. Wangus is a word I use to describe Wagyu Angus crossbreed briskets. Now, I've heard rumblings in my comment section that all YouTubers should use only regular Angus briskets like the ones people can get at Costco and Walmart and Sam's Club or wherever. But in my opinion, the same principles apply to these Wangus briskets as regular choice or prime grade Angus briskets. If a method works for a Wangus brisket, it'll work for an Angus brisket and vice versa. Do you have more room for error if you overcook a Wangus brisket like this one? Yes, 100%. It'll still be good even if you overcooked it because all of that extra collagen and fat will add to the perception of juiciness, even though the meat fibers are totally overcooked and crumbly and grainy and pot roasty. Whereas a choice grade Angus brisket that's overcooked could turn out pretty much inedible. But I'm not in the business of overcooking brisket, especially when our finishing temperatures aren't going above 190, so don't fret. This method will work just as well for your choice grade brisket from Walmart. Now, I won't go into the detail about this trim job I'm doing here, but I will point out one important thing. With hot and fast cooking, there is not a lot of time to render the fat cap, so it's really important to get it really thin. Try to go for 1/4 inch or just below 1/4 inch in thickness. Moving on to the rub, I'm spritzing the brisket with some water to act as a binder, and then I'm starting with the back side, layering with a layer of black coarse ground pepper, then some kosher salt, then some Lowry's seasoned salt, and finally some MSG. Then I flip the brisket over and I do a heavier layer of pepper, a layer of kosher salt, and then some Lowry's, and finally a light sprinkling of MSG. It's actually not just MSG, it's MSG mixed with disodium inosinate and guanylate, also known as I+G, or the brand is called Make It Meaty that I'm using, and it makes brisket tasty AF. And speaking of things that are tasty, I love having a dram or two of scotch while I'm tending my smoker, and that's why I love the sponsor for this video, ZBiotics. ZBiotics is a probiotic drink that breaks down the byproduct of alcohol most responsible for rough mornings after drinking. This is good science at its finest. I just drink a bottle 30 minutes before having an alcoholic drink, and while I drink, it's working to break down that toxic byproduct that's building up in my gut. As we come up to the holiday season, I'm going to be using it more and more often. It just removes that extra layer of grogginess and lack of motivation the next day, and it helps me feel more productive. And if you don't like it, there's no risk to you because it comes with a 100% money-back guarantee, which is one of the big reasons I like this brand. They really stand behind their product. It's also a really easy gift to give to the person who's hard to buy for, especially if they like to have a few drinks with their barbecue. For anyone planning to have some drinks this holiday season, you can give them the gift of a better next morning. Go to zbiotics.com/SmokeTrailsBBQ and use my code SmokeTrailsBBQ at checkout to get 15% off your first order today. Now moving on to starting the smoker. We had a big dump of snow up here in Canada this weekend, so I'm brushing off my Oklahoma Joes and I'm making sure that the stack isn't clogged with that pesky white stuff. Then I'm chopping up some kindling to get the fire started in the firebox. Now normally if I'm smoking low and slow, I'd use charcoal and much smaller splits, but we're doing hot and fast for this brisket around 325 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, so I can use much bigger splits. And one of the big additional benefits of this hot and fast method is on smaller offsets like Oklahoma Joes that like to run at higher temperatures of around 300 to 350, you'll be fighting the fire a lot less and you'll have a much easier time maintaining the fire. I'm loading up a fire basket with some splits in a crisscross pattern. There's really no method here to this. If the splits were shorter, I would probably do a log cabin format, but honestly, it doesn't really matter for a small offset, especially because I'm using this, my grill gun, to get the fire started. Even with cold splits, the grill gun will get a fire started in about 60 seconds, and it has the added benefit of working as a cigar lighter, so I can impress my YouTube viewers and also my wife with how cool I am. Just look at how impressed she is. Heading back to our brisket, it's had a chance to soak up the rub, so I'm laying down 2 sheets of foil, I'm placing the brisket on the foil, and I'm rolling up the edges to make a little boat. That's right, we're foil boating the brisket at the very start of the cook. But wait a second, Steve, that's going to wash away the rub and prevent the smoke from getting to the bottom of the brisket. That's what I'm sure you're thinking, but hear me out. With every hot and fast brisket I've done in the past, there's a real risk of drying out the edges before the brisket gets up to temperature and starts sweating out the moisture it needs to protect itself from the high heat and cook more evenly. So I'm solving that problem by foil boating it first, which will allow it to get up to temperature more gently for the first 2 hours. And once it's up to around 110 to 130 internal and it's sweating out a lot of moisture, I'm going to remove it from the foil boat and give it 2 hours of smoke to set the bark on the bottom. The brisket will be sweating at this point, so it won't dry out in the face of the higher heat. And finally, I'll do 2 hours back in the foil boat to finish it up to an internal temperature of 190 degrees Fahrenheit for a total cook time of 6 hours. We're sacrificing a bit of smoke and bark on the bottom of the brisket, but this way we'll get a much juicier and more evenly cooked brisket. And to be honest, no one really cares about the bottom of the brisket anyway. It's all about that jet black, delicious bark on the top. Now moving on to smoking the brisket. I'm placing the brisket on the smoker sideways near the stack. The only reason I'm doing it sideways is really to fit this large water pan in my small offset smoker. With any hot and fast method, we're producing a lot of direct radiant heat from the firebox, and that can dry out a brisket really quickly at higher temperatures. So I'm combating this with a massive heat sink in the form of a water pan. Well, in this case, I'm using snow because it's all around me, but it will soon be water. And the water pan is going to absorb most of that radiant heat and allow the more gentle convective heat to cook the brisket, which is what we want. If I didn't use a water pan, that direct heat would probably grill the brisket up like a tough, dry steak within 2 hours. So really, the bigger the water pan, the better. Now all that's left to do is maintaining the temperature between 325 to 350 while rotating the brisket every 30 minutes for the first 2 hours. Now, after 2 hours, the bark on the top of the brisket is on its way to being set, but it's not quite there. You'll notice, though, that it's starting to sweat out quite a bit of moisture, and that's how we know it's ready to handle the high heat without that foil boat. So I'm removing the brisket from the foil boat and placing it back in the smoker. I'm dumping the liquid out of the foil boat, but I'm saving the foil boat for later because that brisket is going to need to go back in. If you're wondering, I have this size of fire, my intake damper is all the way open, but the firebox door is shut and my exhaust damper is almost all the way closed. But because this is a modified 5-inch stack on my Oklahoma Joe's, your regular Oklahoma Joe's stack damper would probably be approximately halfway open. Now, I play around with these settings throughout the cook depending on the size of the fire. It's not a replacement for having to read the fire and monitor it and keep it at a certain size and play around with it constantly, adding new splits every 20 or 30 minutes or so, but it is a rough idea of how I'm maintaining those temperatures on my smoker. At the 4-hour mark, the brisket is around 165 internal and it's starting to develop some nice dark bark. So I'm placing it back in the foil boat and I'm letting it ride for a final 2 hours, making sure to rotate it every 30 minutes to help it cook more evenly. That's a really important thing to do in this cook, and I'm doing it every 30 minutes for the whole 6 hours. And after 6 hours total, the brisket is around 180 to 190 internal, and it has a rich dark bark on the fat cap, which is exactly what I was going for. So it's coming off the smoker, and here's where I made my big mistake. I wanted to develop this recipe so that someone could smoke the brisket from around 6 a.m. on Saturday until noon, and then hold it in their oven to finish cooking until dinner at around 5 or 6 p.m. That's what I figured would be the most convenient method. So I held the brisket at 175 in my oven until dinner time at 5 p.m. But when I took the brisket out and I probed it, it was still pretty tough. I was pretty sure that it wasn't done and the stakes were high because this was for a friend. But nonetheless, I decided to slice into it for the sake of science. Okay, the moment of truth here. I'm not really that confident about this brisket. I just probed it and it's around 145 throughout the brisket, but it's kind of tough. And when I'm pulling the probe out, it's tough and I'm not sure what this is going to look like, but I'll give it a shot and see how it is. I was thinking about just putting it back in the warming oven for the next 12 hours and just scrapping my plan, but I really want to see if this is cooked. So let's just send it. It's cutting through really nicely. As I get to the bottom, the flat is a little bit tougher than normally with most of my briskets, but not that bad. I'll open it up here. It looks pretty nice. It looks nice and juicy. I'm just gonna dip this in some of the tallow here on the board. And I've got some tallow on the side that I'm just gonna coat the slices in as I go. This is actually looking pretty good. It's better than I thought. And I'm kind of glad that I sliced into this and didn't chicken out, because it looks actually pretty good. Okay, let's take a slice from the flat here. I'm gonna do it a little bit thinner than I normally do. Okay. This actually looks pretty good. That's a slice of the flat. See if it bends over. It bends over really nicely. The bark is absolutely amazing. Let's squish this bark here and see how rendered it is. The bark is pretty well rendered, but it's actually, the fat is not as rendered as I would have hoped. It's still kind of sticking, it doesn't squish as much. And even though you can see that yellow kind of line up there, it isn't as rendered as I would hope for this brisket. So I'm gonna do a quick pull test here. So I'll just pull the top here. It's pretty tough. The bottom actually pulls apart really nicely. This flat is definitely on its way to being done, but the point up here is still really tough. I can't even tear it with my fingers. So again, let's tear this. And I'm gonna give it a taste now. The bark is amazing. The bark is so good, but it's underdone. Needs more time. I'll take a bite of the flat here. The flat is super good, actually. It's got that prime ribby type taste. It's not pot roasty at all. It's actually delicious. But it could also use a bit more time. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these two halves of the brisket, I'm gonna wrap them up, I'm gonna put them back in my Masterbuilt electric smoker, and I'm gonna hold them at 150 overnight to finish them off. And in the morning, hopefully they should be perfect. As you saw, the brisket was not even near done, so I decided to stop messing around and just do a technique that I knew would work. I wrapped the brisket in butcher paper with 50-50 beef tallow mixed with clarified butter. Then I placed it in a pan with half a cup of water in it. I foiled it tightly and I held it in my Masterbuilt electric smoker overnight at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, round 2. Let's see if this turned out any better. This has been holding overnight for about 12 hours now since the last time I sliced into it. Let's check out what we got here. I can tell already just by lifting it up, it already feels more jiggly. You can see that the sliced ends look a little bit oxidized. They're kind of green. And I'll just pour out some of this tallow onto the brisket, give it a bit of sheen. I'm gonna be coating the slices with this tallow, so that's why I'm dumping it out of the wrap here. All right, let's take a look at the flat first. I'll just put the point over here. It looks good. I can tell that it's a lot more juicy. It's a lot more rendered since the last time I cut into it. We'll do a slice like the one that I did last night. Just doing a really thin 1/4 inch slice. It is cutting like a dream. It's cutting a lot better now. Just folds over. And now let's do the same test that we did before. It's a lot more bendy. The grains are pulling apart a little bit more easily. And let's see, once we pull this point part apart, it pulls apart a lot easier. It's still a little bit tough, but it's a lot easier than last night. And let's pull the flat apart. The flat is perfect. And the reason that this pulls apart a little bit harder is because on this particular brisket, the grains are running exactly the opposite direction as the flat. So I'm not too worried about that. Let's see if the fat has rendered a little bit more. It has. I can definitely see a difference since last night. The fat has rendered all the way down to the meat. That doesn't increase the amount of the caramelization or the yellow exterior here that has a lot of flavor. That is done at higher temperatures in the actual smoker itself, but the fat does continue to render all the way down to the meat, and it gets a lot softer, but it still remains white and it has sort of a neutral flavor. It doesn't continue to develop the flavor of that yellowed, sort of caramelized fat on the exterior of the bark there. But this is perfect. This is perfect brisket. I'm gonna take a bite of it now. Let's pull this apart. Again, starting with the point. Really good. It's retained that prime ribby texture. It hasn't got pot roasty, even though I've held it for an additional 12 hours at 150. The bark is amazing. Absolutely phenomenal. Everything is perfect about this bite. Now, as for the flat, very good. Again, it's still retained that prime ribby beef flavor. It's not lost all its flavor. Doesn't taste pot roasty. Very good brisket. Now, moving on to the point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a perpendicular slice to the grain here. I'll set that aside. And then I'm going to start making slices of the point. I'm going to do them pretty thin because this is a gift for a friend. And typically, I like to give them thinner slices because it just goes further. The brisket goes further. It can feed more people. And it's just not as filling. When you take one big point slice and it's super thick, like 1/2 inch thick, it tends to be the only piece of brisket that the person eats because it's so much food. So I like to do the point a little bit thinner, especially if it's perfectly cooked like this. I can tell this is awesome. It definitely benefited from that longer rest period. Now I'm gonna stop there because what I wanna do is I want to coat my hand in tallow, both my hands, and then I want to prepare that slice, and then I'm going to put it. I had to pause for a second to change my battery pack, and that's why I made the mistake of slicing too much, because sometimes you get sidetracked before you can coat all the slices in tallow, and then your slices start to get oxidized, and that is not good. So we want to make sure we get the fat on them as soon as possible, because it just tastes so much better. This is what they do at popular barbecue restaurants like Franklin Barbecue and La Barbecue in Austin, which I visited recently. They coat the slices in tallow or some sort of mixture of tallow and something else, possibly. And then they serve them up like this. And that's why they're so shiny and delicious and fatty, because they're all covered in tallow, which is delicious. So I'll continue with my slices. Just gonna do 3 there. Now I could take this little chunk off here, and that's probably, normally would be a burnt end, but the method we used to do this didn't really create the best burnt ends on the bottom side, just because we foil boated it for most of the cook. So I'm okay with that though. It's still good meat. Now this is a bit of a weird one here. What I'm gonna do is just slice that off. There's just a big chunk of fat in here that I don't like that much. So I'm gonna chuck that out. And this is pretty much perfect for burnt ends here, but I'm just gonna do a couple more slices because it just goes further when people are serving it up to their friends and family. If you have lots of slices, lots of options. And now these guys are perfect for burnt ends. I'm gonna do a little bit smaller because I want everyone to have the experience of having a burnt end. If you make larger burnt ends, then only a couple of people get to eat them. And now I'm going to steal a little slice of this point here to taste. Okay, so trying out the point just to make sure it's fully rendered. It is. The collagen is fully rendered, so it definitely benefited from that extra 12 hours of holding. Perfect. I am happy with this brisket. Now I'm just gonna carve up the rest of the flat here. Now you can see that I've got a little bit of a problem here because if I just go this way, then I'll get, I'll lose that much of the meat. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna try to go at an angle like that. Maybe a little bit less. But that way I'll kind of fan blade this out and get longer cuts. And then this guy, it's pretty dry, so I probably wouldn't make any more slices here. I'm just gonna chunk this up into kind of flat burnt ends, and then I'll soak them with as much tallow as I possibly can. And there you have it. That's a nice little box of brisket for my friends. I think they're really going to enjoy it. So to summarize, I would call this method the hot and fast 2-2-2-16 method. Kind of a mouthful, but it's 2 hours in the foil boat at 325 to 350, then 2 hours unwrapped at the same temperature. Then it goes back in the foil boat for an additional 2 hours for 6 hours total, again at 325 to 350. Then it comes off of the smoker. It goes into a holding oven. It can go into your oven, your electric smoker, any kind of holding device you have that holds reasonably consistent temperatures at 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 16 hours, and then you can slice into it and you're gonna get an amazing brisket. What are the potential use cases? Well, you could start smoking at 6 p.m. on Saturday, go all the way up to midnight for 6 hours, and then you could hold it until dinner the next day. You could smoke it from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Saturday and then have it for lunch the next day. Or you could smoke it from 10 a.m. to around 4 p.m. on Saturday, and then you hold it for 16 hours till around 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning on Sunday. You refrigerate it, and then a couple hours before dinner on Sunday, you just reheat it. So there's a lot of use cases, but in all of these use cases, you can shave a lot of time off your cook because it only takes 6 hours of active cooking time. So if you only have limited time on the weekend to cook a brisket, this method will probably work well for you. I hope this method does save you guys some time, and I hope it helped you out, Brett, because your question was the reason for this video. And if you guys are interested in all things brisket and barbecue related, consider joining my Patreon page. I take requests all the time for experiments that my Patreon supporters want to do, but they don't have the time or resources to do. That's kind of what my YouTube channel is about. So I'd love to see you guys on Patreon, and I'll definitely see you in the next video. Happy smoking.